it's a real pleasure today to be able to introduce to you our speaker, Kayvan Khalatbar. As a physician, I've been deeply interested for a long time in the potential role for cannabis in human health. And this summer I was listening to NPR, and I had one of those, what they call driveway moments, when the moderator for the show, Colorado Matters, introduced our speaker, Kayvan, when he was presenting three, what he called ganjapreneurs, that he had selected to interview about the current state of the cannabis industry in Colorado. But then I discovered that ganjapreneur hardly defines our speaker today. Kayvan is not only a multifaceted entrepreneur, owning 13 businesses in multiple industries, employing more than 400 people in 8 states, but he's also a fierce advocate for criminal justice and drug policy reform, the rights of people experiencing homelessness, and also promoting access to creative opportunities for our youth and our underserved populations, especially in the Denver area. And because of his passion, he's actually running for mayor of Denver. And so let's give this fascinating and interesting gentleman a warm Rotary welcome.
Thank you all for having me. I greatly appreciate being here, and Gary for helping facilitate it. You've been great to work with. I actually suspended my mayoral campaign a few months ago after 18 months and outraising the current mayor, Hancock, and actually getting a lot of traction down there because I recently took custody of 2 young girls, 8 and 11. I've been a mentor in the Denver Kids program for about 10 years now with an older kid, 18, who is their older brother. His name is Ernest. All 3 of these kids were recently adopted by their foster parent, Monica. She's been a foster mother in the Denver area for about 35 years, had more than 200 kids go through her home. These are the first 3 that she adopted, and she's 86 years old now. And I could see the kind of the pain that she was experiencing, not knowing what was going to happen with these girls when she was unable to care for them anymore, and decided to take on that challenge. So one of those things you don't anticipate, but certainly happy to take it on, and I'm integrating into their life as well as I can right now. I'm going to set a timer because I do tend to ramble. And I also might talk a little fast if I start doing that. Gary, you have permission to throw anything you'd like at me. So I've been in the cannabis industry for, actually before that, I wanted to say congratulations on 100 years. I think that's pretty excellent. I've actually attended over 100 Rotary meetings, but not as a member. I used to serve food at a banquet club, at a private dining club. In Lincoln, Nebraska, so I've definitely seen quite a few presentations myself. I've been on the other side. So I've been in the cannabis industry for a very long time. I started in 2005. It was shortly after I moved here from Lincoln, Nebraska. It's been a 14-year path almost that I've learned so much. I've realized how this plant is about to impact, I think, every facet of our society. I was having some conversations with folks before I got up here when we were waiting in line about how I don't even view cannabis as a drug. I think in the sense that it gets talked about as much as it does. You know, certainly on the at least on the recreational side, medically, the potential for it is absolutely phenomenal, and we've barely scratched the surface. It being used in such a rudimentary fashion as so many hundreds of thousands, millions of patients are across the country who are finding such relief is actually pretty astonishing, considering the complexity, which I'll get into a little bit later, of this plant, but even more so on the industrial side. And what we have is an opportunity with industrial hemp, which was just recently legalized by the federal government as part of the Farm Bill a couple of months ago. So my first foray into this was with a group called Safer Alternative for Enjoyable Recreation. And it existed to compare, at least in policy, cannabis to alcohol. Alcohol is a drug. I'm not here to demonize it, but it does kill 1 in 7 working age Americans related to the consumption of it. Long-term health consequences, suicide, violence, traffic fatalities. It is quite dangerous. Cannabis does not carry that kind of harm with it. And I always thought that was very interesting, especially considering at the time when I got involved in 2005, there were over 11,000 people that were going to jail every year in Colorado for simple cannabis possession, over 800,000 nationwide, creating all sorts of barriers to folks finding fair opportunities to housing, workforce, opportunities, child custody, financial aid, really precluded progress from a lot of folks who just so happen to choose to use a drug far safer than alcohol. So that picture on the top left was my first moment having my picture in the media. It was in the Denver Post, and it was in pursuit of passing Initiative 100 in Denver. It did pass in 2005. It made us the first major city in the country to decriminalize cannabis for adults. Unfortunately, the next year, arrests did not go down. Our mayor at the time, our recent governor, John Hickenlooper, refused to really acknowledge the will of the voters who overwhelmingly supported this decriminalization, and arrests went up the following year. So that's also me in that nice chicken suit over there on the right with the sign that asks a very simple question. The man, John Hickenlooper, refused to answer why he refused to push law enforcement to potentially be a little bit more soft in their enforcement of cannabis. We did that at town hall meetings. I was at the first one at a school on Federal and Spear just before I got thrown out. We ended up doing it at 4 additional town hall meetings. By the last one, he had come in a different car with a different driver, was tucked down on the floorboard in the back seat, and went in the back of the church. But we ended up getting what we wanted out of that conversation was that it continued, and that in 2007, we were able to pass a lowest law enforcement priority initiative in Denver that really forced our hand to make them stop arresting folks. And then we'll get into this a little later too, but I was also the lead proponent. My office ran Initiative 300 in Denver in 2016, which made Denver the first city in the country, first city in the world really, to regulate the social use of cannabis. Our mayor, the current one, who I have a lot of issues with far outside of cannabis, really thwarted the implementation of that. I'll get into that a little bit later as well. But had a lot of roles in the activist kind of realm. That's always rode very parallel with my advocacy. It wasn't just about being this guy that felt that adults should have this right to consume. We knew that we were building an industry and that we had to participate in professionalizing it and changing the stigmas and the perception around cannabis, not knowing that we were going to get where we're at today with it. We just did it because we knew if this was going to grow as an industry, that if we were going to really get buy-in from all stakeholders, a lot of whom back then were a little bit skeptical of our progress, that we needed to put on a good face for the industry. Top left, I've lobbied in DC with Congress. I educated members of Congress for the last 8 years on the Hill. And we go out there for NCIA's lobby days. I think there were 15 of us the first year. Last year, I think we had over 700 people going, visiting every single member of Congress. Participated in fun live debates with Happy Haynes down in Denver. She's works in the mayor's office and currently runs Denver Parks and Rec. That was my first time ever on live television, debating her on CNN ahead of Amendment 64 passing in Denver. And then I've really carried my advocacy in a lot of the professional organizations in the industry to make sure that people know that there is a contingent within the industry that is certainly doing everything that we can to make sure that this is an industry that gets treated like any other industry, but also understands the opportunity we have to be not just another industry, but a much better one. And that's something that we fight for through the National Cannabis Industry Association, all the lobbying work we do on the Hill, pushing for tax reform, banking opportunities for the industry, and really to take it out of the shadows and bring it into the light. I've worked with Council on Responsible Cannabis Regulation to self-regulate these businesses and take the best practices that we've learned in the industry and make sure that they get perpetuated, disseminated throughout the industry, and been involved in organizations like the Resource Innovation Institute, which encourages environmental stewardship. Especially in Colorado, that's a big issue because of all of our cultivation that happens under high-intensity lamps indoors. We don't have the opportunity to grow outside like they do in California and some other warmer climates. So we have to be very conscious about the technologies that we use and make sure that as we're growing this industry that we're not putting undue pressure on our environment. And then probably the one I'm most proud of, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, is the Minority Cannabis Business Association, which I chair, which is really there to advocate for opportunities for people of color in the cannabis industry who do not, because of our current laws, in many places have the opportunity for ownership, for employment. We have not acknowledged the disparity in arrests that exists in this country as they relate to Black and brown people being arrested for not just cannabis but other drugs, and the damage that's been done in those communities and to those families. So we advocate for reinvestment in those communities to try to bring them up back to a level playing field. One of the beauties of being in the industry so early is we've participated in a lot of firsts. And I was a founder of Denver Relief, which is one of the first medical cannabis companies in Colorado. We ended up selling that in 2016 to Willie Nelson's group in Terrapin Care Station, which was founded up here in Boulder. We became their first Denver location. But a couple years after that, in 2011, we founded Denver Relief Consulting. And that was to take these lessons learned from us and make sure that when new operators were getting off the ground, new programs off the ground in new states, especially more conservative states than Colorado, that folks were not starting from scratch like we did, that they had the opportunity to learn from someone who had been there, because you cannot find information in the internet or often consultants that are willing to share reliable data, reliable best practices and processes that have worked. And we really found an opportunity for us, especially with groups like Cresco Labs. I'm a co-founder of this group that was founded in Chicago in 2014. And they really made it a point to change the perception of the cannabis industry. And what outside of Colorado is an incredibly conservative state. And they've been able to do that very well. We brought on a James Beard Award-winning chef to create an edible line and to try to bring some of those mainstream, some of those known people and kind of cultural cooking into this industry. We were the first cannabis company to sponsor a national sporting event in the Chicago Marathon. Our medical advisory board includes people from Rush Medical Center, Northwestern University, Illinois, UIC College of Pharmacy, and the team physician for the Chicago Bulls and the Chicago White Sox. And just about 3 months ago, with not just Illinois and Pennsylvania, which I have up there, I have them up there because we're currently the largest market share in both those states as far as cannabis production. They also have licenses in 8 other states. All those were rolled up and went public up in Canada a few months ago, and that was my second exit, so to say, in the industry. But they continue to grow and impress and bring in really traditional talent that continues to make waves and change perceptions of cannabis across the country. These are some of my other companies. Silver Sage Wellness is vertically integrated in Las Vegas. We have Mana Molecular, which is a transdermal patch company that's now found in 15 different states. Standard Wellness and the Forest are affiliated in Ohio. I was just out there last week. We executed the first legal sale of medical cannabis in the state of Ohio at our dispensary in Sandusky, Ohio, which is really interesting. That the group Standard has its cultivation and processing facilities in a town called Gibsonburg, Ohio. And Gibsonburg is about 99.5% people who voted for Trump, and we managed to get them over half the residents of the town to sign a petition during our merit-based application process saying that they wanted us there. And a lot of it was because we went in and had conversations with them about their concerns, about the potential issues they saw with cannabis coming into their backyard, and we were able to change a lot of minds there. Ended up getting letters of support from the mayor, unanimous city council, township, county commissioners, the school board, the police chief, and we've formed a tremendous partnership with a local municipality that I think most folks would have never thought would buy into this being in their backyard. They also gave us 20 acres in an industrial park that was sitting a little vacant. The current mayor ran on it as the road to nowhere and said that he was going to put some businesses in there, and by gosh, he did. Diamond Pack is a packaging company, Vapor Slide, and accessories company. Birdie's an arts magazine, and it's 6th year down in Denver that I started. And then Sexy Pizza, stupid name, but pretty good pizza. We've been around for about 11 years. We currently are working on our 4th and 5th locations and converting into an employee-owned company, which I'm really excited about. Started out of the folks I worked with at that cannabis advocacy initiative, SAFER, way back in the day. So just want to get that out of the way. We've done some fun stuff in culture. I talked about selling to Willie Nelson. I was a producer on a couple films, Rolling Papers, which is a documentary about Denver post foray into legal cannabis. When we brought it on here in Colorado, I was a producer for Super Troopers 2. We got Jim McMahon, Super Bowl winning quarterback, to consume cannabis illegally in Chicago to prove a point that veterans and football players need access to this medicine, even though their qualifying conditions were not approved by the state in Illinois. And then I'm also a shareholder in High Times, which just went public as well. But that gets us into the perception stuff now that I've rambled on enough about me. And I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that cannabis is harmless or that the industry is perfect. I'm not one of those people. It certainly has a lot that it can work on, and we are working on it collectively. There are undoubtedly, just like any other industry, bad players, but a lot of the perception that exists in the mainstream from folks that are a bit decoupled from the industry is really based in things that happened about 80 years ago when cannabis was initially prohibited. And in the early 1900s, we had an influx of Mexican immigrants after the Mexican Revolution. And these Mexican immigrants used the term marijuana. They did not use cannabis. If they did, we might not be on the same path, because at the time, cannabis was actually found in many medicines that folks in the United States were using. And the term marijuana was used as a way to create this picture, to portray these Mexican immigrants as folks that were coming up here and stealing our jobs. During the initial Tax Act of 1937, which the Marijuana Tax Act, which made cannabis illegal, they actually got portrayed, cannabis did, marijuana did, as being this drug that made people of color crazed and sexually assaulting white women and violent towards folks. And that was really the impetus around its illegality. A lot of it had to do with jobs, similar to what San Francisco did with Chinese workers around opium a couple decades before this, and what places around the West Coast and in northern United States did against black folks after they started coming from the South and moving throughout the country regarding their use of cocaine. So we've always had this issue of people of color being thrown under the bus for reasons that had really nothing to do with that drug, but ultimately the drug was blamed. And that's created a huge issue in perpetuity, because today, as we were talking at this table, cannabis exists as a Schedule I drug. Now, its scheduling came around in the 1970s under Richard Nixon during the Controlled Substances Act. And if something's a Schedule I drug, like methamphetamine, it essentially means that it has no medicinal value and a high propensity for addiction. And cannabis still sits there. And that's why we do not have access to banking, and we do not have all the tax deductibility opportunities that many other businesses do. I'm going to get into the profit centers, but right now, as a retail center, we cannot deduct most of our retail expenses. We cannot deduct our marketing expenses on our taxes. So whereas, my pizzeria, I may have a 30 to 35% tax liability. On my cannabis businesses, some people, depending on if they have these other production facilities associated with this retail, may be paying 50 or 60% as a tax rate, which has really taken out the profitability opportunity for this industry. And it's not quite what people think as far as making hand over fist. Some are, but not all. So today, it still sits as a Schedule I, but I truly believe we're going to see some progress on that in the next couple of years, which I'll talk about here soon. But here's our population as far as prison, federal prison, and state jails with regard to drug offenses. And you'll notice that we've thrown tens of millions of Americans in jail over the course of the last few decades. And again, it's created all these issues to folks finding fair opportunities. And unfortunately, it's disproportionately affected people of color. 80% of the people in our federal prisons and 60% in our state jails for drug offenses are people of color, even though our country is made up of 62% whites. And studies after study has shown that use rates across all races is relatively equal. Even as we have legalized, and we always have to keep in mind, us folks here in the industry that are in the business of it, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, a lot of places across the country, it is still illegal. We still have hundreds of thousands of people across this country going to jail for using this relatively benign substance compared to others that are legal: alcohol, tobacco, things of that nature. But even in the legal industry, these people are not finding opportunities. It's either past criminal infractions that are precluding them from ownership or workforce opportunities in the industry. They don't have access to this kind of generational business acumen in their communities to be able to stand one of these up. And they don't have access to the capital. You know, it is impossible for a business in this industry to go to a bank and get a loan like I did take out for my pizzerias when we started them. And it really takes having a network of people that do have expendable income to be able to start one of these businesses. And those do not exist in communities of color. So again, I go back to the most proud organization that I currently serve on the board of. That's the Minority Cannabis Business Association. And we have written model legislation and a model municipal ordinance that we've now gotten in front of lawmakers across the country. If there is an effort to legalize or to revise current laws on the books across the country, we have had conversations with those lawmakers, and we have found a lot of progress and are really the foundation for the equity programs that now exist in states like Massachusetts and Maryland and in municipalities throughout California that make sure that they are addressing not just the ownership and support role opportunities, that we're looking at investing some of the tax revenues that we have in some of these communities that have been disenfranchised by the war on drugs, and expunging past offenses. I don't know if y'all recall a couple weeks ago, the mayor of Denver came out and opened up 50,000 cases of cannabis possession for expungement, which means that they would be entirely removed from those records and hopefully give people a fair shake in employment and housing opportunities. That was because of myself and MCBA hounding him on that for 6 years. It's unfortunate it took until an election year for him to do that, but I'm glad it's done. Regardless, we've recently done expungement clinics up and down the West Coast where we pay for people's legal fees and the administrative costs associated with that expungement. And that's turned into a National Expungement Week, which we held back in November. And I think we had 13 cities participate in that first one. So we're going to be doing that on an ongoing basis. Another one of kind of the misperceptions, and I was chatting with a lot of people about this, was the kind of the chemical makeup of cannabis. I think when we talk about cannabis in society, we talk about THC, which is the psychoactive component. That's what gets you high in cannabis. And then we have CBD, which is a non-psychoactive cannabinoid that is really associated with pain relief, anti-inflammation, being able to cure neuropathy, having the ability to help folks deal with chemotherapy when going through cancer or nausea, as it relates to taking medications for AIDS or other conditions. But these are only 2 of the more than 100 cannabinoids that exist in cannabis. And there's a lot of reasons why we don't know more about them. Some of the reason is because breeders over the years, underground, not working in this regulated market, didn't know about these other cannabinoids. All they knew about was the one that got us high. So when they were breeding these plants, if it didn't get them high, it wasn't a good strain. So over time, over these past couple decades of this cannabis existing underground, we've slowly bred out all of these other cannabinoids. But now that we're understanding them again, and we have these places where we can really engage in formal breeding programs, we're starting to see them really come back up. Everybody in this room, every animal has an endocannabinoid system. That's something that a lot of folks don't know. Endocannabinoid system is something that'll accept these cannabinoids and really allows our body to exist in homeostasis. It allows all of our different systems to work together and to exist in a state where it can function best. So I'm really excited to see where these 111 different cannabinoids that exist in cannabis, when we start to understand them, how we can address certain ailments physically, mentally, with regard to addiction, all these things to really fill in the gaps where our bodies are deficient and missing out. Two that I'm most excited about that we know a little bit more about than we did a couple years ago are CBN, which is wonderful for insomnia, is also shown tremendous progress in developing bone growth, and then CBG, which is a tremendous appetite stimulant, especially for folks that are dealing with conditions that really take away their appetite from the medications that they take. So I'm really excited about where that's going to go, and I think as soon as we get that off of the Schedule 1 status, or we have the feds give some deferring to states that have legalized this to conduct more research and open the door to academic institutions and private companies engaging in research, I think we're going to see this really blow up in a big way. And one of the things that's really pushed this conversation is obviously our opioid epidemic. And in every state in this country where we have cannabis laws on the books, we've seen a decrease in opioid dependency and overdose. In Colorado, it's reported as high as 25% of a decrease, where in every single state where we don't have those laws on the books, we've seen opioid dependency and overdose continue to go up. A lot of the opportunity exists in, again, hemp I mentioned was legalized in the Farm Bill here recently. I think that's going to start the conversation really nationally about what hemp and cannabis have as far as potential. And I wanted to clarify as well that hemp is cannabis. You're going to hear a lot of conversation about these being two different things, but they're all the same plant. They're the same species. They're just different cultivars that have different cannabinoid profiles. The only thing that makes hemp different from cannabis, as far as the feds in most states are concerned, is that hemp has a threshold that it can't exceed of 0.3% THC content. So there really is no difference. Please understand that. I think there was a truck that went across the border here recently we were talking about that the law enforcement opened it up and they saw a bunch of what they thought was marijuana and ended up busting these folks, and it was just really industrial hemp. Another one of the misconceptions is certainly the profit opportunity in this industry. It is not quite what people make it out to be. I think a lot of the publicly traded companies in Canada and some here in the United States have created this perception that now we all have access to it and can get into it for less money. But most of these companies are incredibly overvalued, and I'll give you a couple examples here. The largest deal to date for an operator was Constellation Brands, which runs Corona and Modelo and a bunch of other liquor brands. They recently bought a stake in Canopy Growth, which is an old client of ours up in Canada, that they paid $3.8 billion. I'm sorry. They paid, I forget what the number was they paid for, but it valued the company at $3.8 billion. This is a company that did $40 million revenue last year. That's a 95x revenue valuation. I wish I could sell my pizzerias for like 300 million right now. I would be out in a heartbeat. Marlboro recently invested $13 billion for a 35% stake in Juul Labs. Juul Labs is a vaporizer producer. They do the Juul cigarettes. They also own PAX, which is a cannabis vaporizer company in the industry. That valued that company at $38 billion, which is more than Ford Motors, Delta, and Target. But that one probably actually has little legs under it because their revenue is quite excessive. Getting right there. The reality is that most cannabis businesses fail. I would say 95% of the businesses in Colorado have failed. They've just been bought by new owners or reinvested in. That does not give the perception of failure. I would also say that Colorado is losing its position. Hopefully under this current governor, we're going to see that change. But Colorado is quickly falling behind with regard to other states, not just on the investment front and what we can do with our money to make money because our regulations are overburdened, but in just seeing the progress that I think we're going to need to see in hemp, which I really want to have this conversation with y'all after the fact. I know I can't talk about it now because I have rambled, but there's nothing in this room that you can't make from hemp, and to the opportunity to empower local farmers, local economies, especially rural parts of the country, to stop subsidizing farmers and crops is a huge one. And I truly believe that we're going to see cannabis in just about every part of our society coming up here, not just the ways that we think in yoga and massage and concerts and whatnot, but Ironman competitions, weightlifters, they have cannabis gyms out there. These people are competitive and winning Olympic medals, winning races. And then we're going to see it in food. You're getting at me, Bill, I know it. And then just think about the international opportunities and all the things that we've talked about between hemp, medical cannabis, and social use cannabis. This is just an inkling of what we've seen as far as federal legalization in these different countries. So we've got a lot of way to go. I think the revenue potential could break the computer and could be one of the largest industries that this world has ever seen. And we're on our way there, but it's not going to be available to everyone. Sorry. Thank you for letting me meander.
Thank you, Kayvan. Kayvan, I'm going to suggest that people who want to talk with him afterwards come down. It was a fascinating talk. I want to, on behalf of Boulder Rotary, present you with a 100-dose vaccine and that will be contributed in your name to the polio fund. And to remind everyone to get vaccinated. There are 25 new cases of measles, of all things, in Portland, Oregon today because people didn't get vaccinated. Thank you again for your talk.
No time for questions?